Dear learners, welcome to the module 10 of unit 2. We were discussing upon qualitative research and we have seen in different modules different techniques which can be used in qualitative research. Today we are going to discuss a very important topic, that is the quality concerns, how to check the quality and what benchmarks or standards are expected from a researcher who is doing qualitative research. To give you some background, there is a debate going on in the academic front whether qualitative researchers are superior to quantitative researchers or quantitative researchers are better than qualitative researchers. Why this so? In quantitative research, we get numbers and we use theories and you get ultimately a hypothesis tested or some definite result. Whereas in qualitative research, we create stories or we develop narratives, and these narratives and the underpinning ideas could be subjective. So there is different perspective among the researchers, and individuals when they develop narratives, it can be highly subjective too. So there is no such universal formula that is considered to be a threshold for testing the validity of qualitative research. Now hope you are clear, but this development of qualitative research process in the last couple of decades after 1960, different researchers, they came out with procedures, and these procedures are debated widely, and now we have established procedures and universally accepted systems to check the quality of qualitative researches. So let us go in detail. Today I am using a publication from UK, that is checking quality of qualitative research, and number one is rigor. Rigor means whether your research used an appropriate approach as a key research methods. So there is no such threshold value or there is no such kind of established mechanism to tell you about your research has rigor in it. When you read a particular research, you have to check the terms used by the researcher, the concept presented in the research, and the process followed by the researcher, and how the findings are validated with other researchers. So from right away from the research problem, the research process and the result, interpretation of the result, this should sound rigorous and standard, certain level of standard. In simple terms, that we can say a benchmark to be followed. So number one is rigor. The number 2 point here is credibility. The findings presented, are they meaningful? Here the question comes into our mind. See, I am studying a particular context. I know the results better than someone else. When my study present a particular finding, a person from a different country may not appreciate it or they do not know the context. This happens among several researchers, especially those who do qualitative researches. Even in my personal case, when we publish articles, reviewers, they make comments whether this particular study, how it is going to benefit the academic world. So, we have to come to an understanding that the credibility of the research depends upon following the established norms in qualitative research, and the findings that I identify or the conclusions I draw, that should be following a particular pattern, that is context specific, but at the same time it may be presented, recommended by other researchers worldwide. So, here the question comes is validation. And the third aspect is relevance. This question of relevance is very important because the findings of your study, are they useful? For any research to be useful, the outcomes, it could be generalizable, and number two, replicable, the study can be replicated. So, in many cases the researcher face an issue that how useful that particular study is. So, if we can answer these three questions, that is rigor, and the second aspect is credibility, and the third point is relevance. I wish to add one more point, that is reflexivity. So, reflexivity is another term that check the quality of qualitative researches. So, if we argue that our research has rigor and it is relevant to the context and relevant to the society too, and the reflexivity that indicates that what is the stand of the researcher or the stand of the researchers on a particular issue. So, this way we can address these three problems. Let us start with one by one. The clarity on aim of the research. So, here the first question arises, what are the goals of your research? Why this research is important? And how relevant your study is today, or how relevant this study is for the industry or the community. So, altogether the point number one, if you are clear with the aims of the research, then it will contribute to adding rigor, the rigor factor which we mentioned in the previous slide. The second point is the approach that you are following. Qualitative method is appropriate, whether the study can identify or it can bring out new insights, or how the study interpret the experience of the participants. So, we see quantitative researches and we also find mixed methods. So, whether the findings will reflect and will it be appropriate in the context. So, the second question that a researcher has to address or answer is, the qualitative method is appropriate for the context or the area that you are working on. The third point worth to mention here is the research design. You have to give justification on why you choose a particular research design. Is it appropriate? How it was decided? So, when we see the synopsis of research scholars or the proposal made by researchers, it just mentions few points. It says about the introduction, then the research problem, objectives, and the expected outcomes in brief. So, when we develop our research proposal, one thing that we have to make it in mind that we should follow an appropriate research design. And we have seen in the past slides, U. Flick or John Creswell, MQ pattern, these renowned authors recommended different research designs. So, when you adopt a research design, make sure that you justify that design, why it is appropriate in this particular context of the study. Another important point is justification on the selection of participants. One major criticism I find in qualitative research is selection of the participants. So, here it is the researcher who decides who will be your participant. How far you agree with this? Don't you think the researcher employ biasness, or the convenience of the researcher is the choice for selecting the participant? So, these questions you have to carefully address. When we look into the actual research, whether you or me, we have designed a study, you are going to the field to collect the data, and we have a potential list, the list of potential respondents. So, we assume that these respondents can give you the actual insights. So, we approach respondents. Some may agree, some may disagree, some may not even entertain you, they hesitate to give responses or replies to your question. So, first question comes, what kind of sampling techniques that you adopted? We see probability sampling and non-probability sampling. In qualitative researches, we use purposive sampling, and purposive sampling is meant for identifying the respondent who can give you responses, and that responses may address the research questions. And in the second case, when you go with the purposive sampling, you choose the respondent and the respondent's insights that we record. So, you have to justify that this particular respondent can address that particular area because they are aware of the context. And in the second case, the respondents who are not replied to you, the respondents disagreed to participate. Have you made note of that? What could be the probable reason they do not want to give interview or they do not want to participate in your research? This has to be addressed. Let me share you a small example. We find in PhD research stakeholders study. In PhD defense, a student has to answer what was the basis of choosing a respondent as a stakeholder. So, one of the previous PhD defense, the examiner asked how you can choose a local vendor as a stakeholder of tourism. There are several categories of vendors. Or if a priest of the temple, how you can identify he is a potential respondent for your research. So, this is the second aspect one researcher has to carefully address on. The fifth point is justification on setting of data collection. Perhaps I have repeated this in the last slide, but once again I want to reconfirm that Data collection process is one of the challenging part of any research. How did you collect the data, or any modification that you have done during the process? Because when you go first time to the field, you may come across different problems. The feedback from the respondents that you incorporate in your research. So in the next phase, when you go for data collection, you will be more prepared. And if you made any modification in methods, this has to be mentioned in your study well, so that a researcher can satisfactorily answer the question of how do you collect the data and how could you address that research issue. Then one of the very important part in qualitative research is the relationship between the researcher and participants. Being a researcher, there is a high chance of bias and influence during data collection. See, I take examples from my own personal experience. When we conduct researches, we are in a hurry to get the information from the client. So sometimes we instigate the respondent, or sometimes we ask such kind of questions to get the answer directly from the respondent. Formulation of research question matters here. The data collection and the sample selection process, choice of the location, this all matters. I would like to take an example from my personal experience. When I conducted a study among a community, I identified a gatekeeper. We use the term gatekeeper to indicate the gatekeeper is a person who can connect us with other people in a particular area of research. So with his help, we identified people. So this person normally chooses the respondents whom he knows, or he feels that they can answer your questions. So sometimes you may identify that this person is a relative, perhaps the respondent is the relative of the gatekeeper, or maybe having a particular political ideology. So being a researcher, I have to make my identity separate, and the research which I am looking in or I am addressing, that has to be kept separate. So the biasness part has to be avoided at the best possible or maximum possible manner. And the sixth point continues here: how the researcher responded to the events during the study. Different issues come across, and how you tackle different problems, that matters here. Then did the researcher consider the implication of any changes in the research design? Say for example, we have seen longitudinal or snapshot studies. So at times you may realize that the design that you chosen, that is snapshot, may not work. So you may have to go for a longitudinal study. So this all has to be recorded and also reported in your dissertation. Another important aspect is ethical issues. So these ethical issues we will study in a different unit, but when we consider ethical issues related to data collection, do we hide our real motto and approach the respondent to get answer from them? So here the kind of questions that you ask to get answers from the respondent. So then another case is this area of work, do you get a prior approval from the ethics committee? So make it simple. Let me tell you few points to remember. Make sure that you communicate the motto of the study to your respondent. The process should be transparent, that your goals of the study, why you want to collect the data from that individual, or how the responses are going to be kept, whether the responses will be used as anonymous or the identity of the person is kept anonymous, the confidentiality of the responses, and in many cases such things matters a lot. So, being a researcher, you have to follow the research ethics here, and in universities and colleges there would be a ethics committee. So, normally when a topics get approved, the ethics committee look into the subject and they may also suggest some modifications if required. And this is particularly important when you are dealing with ethnic communities or topics which are sensitive in nature. The eighth point is related to data analysis. The data analysis process is one of the very important part of any research. It involves a lot of effort and you have to work hard to get the themes extracted. So, what method that you have followed, whether you follow content analysis or whether you want to do a thematic analysis, this part we will discuss in another unit. But the detailed description of the analysis process is very important. Then comes the categories or the themes extracted from the corpus of the data and how you are going to present the original result and the codes. And have you got sufficient data to support the findings? What extent contradictory data is taken into the account? So, let me brief you certain important points here. These days we use computer aided qualitative data analysis software. There are different softwares available in the market. You must have heard about NVivo or AI tools in doing qualitative data analysis. So, here question number 1 is, do you have sufficient responses? That means sample size. And number 2 is, the responses that you have, does it fulfill your research requirement? For example, if you ask a question and the respondent says only yes or no, that do not suffice your requirement. You need rich data. That means a in-depth insight. So, the nature of the data is important. And the third aspect is, when you arrange the data, do you omit? That means you feel that this data is not required. And the fourth aspect is, what importance you give to the emotions of the persons, the background of the individual and the context that you are studying upon. In the next phase, how effectively you translate that emotional responses or the contextual importance to the real findings. And finally, the entire process, is it follow a meticulous or systematic process? So, this play a very important role in getting the real result. So, a few very important points that you have to remember. There could be people who give negative or the answers which you are not expected. Do you wish to show that result or you want to hide that? So, this is subject to the research problem and the researcher's integrity, that if contradictory information is given, whether you are going to show it in your dissertation or not. Now comes to the question of findings. Are the findings explicit? Means it directly relate to your research question, and then whether the discussion is it with the evidence of the data give you the evidence to discuss upon the topic, then the credibility, the argument that you are making, is it credible enough? Then comes the findings are discussed in relation to the original research question. So, the one common issue that we find when we do research is, we have research questions but when we reach the result, some occasion there is a variation happens. The research findings sometimes vary from what we set in the beginning as research questions. So, it should be explicit, and number 2, it should be straightly connected with your research objectives. And the last point here is how important is this research, what contribution the outcomes give to the society, the societal, academic and administrative level, managerial implications, what kind of implication your research is producing. So, one of the main purpose of the research is to produce knowledge and how it will be transferred to other populations. So, if you can follow these 10 points, I believe the question of rigor, credibility and other important aspect like reflexivity can be addressed, and your research follows a systematic method accepted widely worldwide. To conclude, there are different steps involved in checking the quality of the research, especially qualitative research. We have seen that rigor, credibility, relevance, the 3 aspects play an important role as a testing factor of the quality of your research. The goals of the research should be clear. You should follow appropriate research method and research design. Selection of the participants play an important role. Ethical issues have to be taken into account. You should follow standard pattern of analysis and the presentation of findings. So, dear learners, once again let me underline the importance of maintaining the quality of qualitative research. It is not just describing what you get from the field. You can create narrative, but building the narrative, coming out with a specific meaning of the narrative and connecting it with the logical aspects or theoretical underpinnings, these all comes or these all reflect in your research. So, the process involves number 1, research goals, specific and achievable, and the design that you adopt, appropriate research design, and then comes selection of participants, the sample size, the respondent and their contribution in terms of the data, then the way you conduct analysis, and finally the outcomes, how efficiently you can translate the descriptions by your respondent into a useful pattern in which the academic world or the society can benefit from it. I hope this session was useful for you. If you have any doubts, please let me know. Thank you.